The official led them over to one of the presumptuously fashioned buildings nearby, between the outer gate and the field. A Death Knight stood beside the open door, but he was too preoccupied with his thoughts to pay it any mind. What he had witnessed on their approach to the city and what it might mean left him confused and apprehensive. Inside, it looked every bit the manner that its exterior had suggested. They were led to the hall, where rows of long tables had been arranged to face the head of the chamber. He surmised that the manor hall had been chosen for its proximity to the gatehouse and the fact that it could comfortably seat several dozen people for whatever these orientations were. "Please make yourselves comfortable," their guide said. "Someone will be with you soon." They took their seats, and it wasn't long before the sound of footsteps could be heard echoing through the servants' entrance. A woman appeared in time with the steps, with a youthful air that made her seem of an age with Alessia. Aside from the color of their hair, however, they were distinctly different. Though conservatively fashioned and arranged, her elegant dress of pastel shades only served to enhance the ample lines of her womanly figure. She made no attempts to openly flaunt herself as she seemed to float across the dais to take her place behind the large desk before them, which somehow made all the more enticing. The soft and refined features of her face lit up in a warm smile, her eyes shimmered in amber hues. Amidst the aura of warmth and hospitality she exuded, Marcus could hear many of the men sigh wistfully at the vision of demure beauty. She stood silently behind the desk for a few moments, after which the smile turned awkward. She stole glances towards where she had appeared from. A dozen seconds passed before she looked directly towards the servants' entrance. Her lips moved with words that Marcus could not hear. A few moments later, a shadow loomed in the doorway and a monstrous creature slithered into the hall. A large body, resembling that of an elderly man, entered first, with heavy strands of greyish hair flowing down over his shoulders. He wore a shirt and coat vaguely resembling that of the customs officer at the border, but this uniform was in the brown and grey of the Erantles militia. Below the hem of his coat, a serpent's body extended from where a human's hips should have been. A Naga. With the clattering of chairs and armor plates, half of the paladins stood up from their seats in alarm. Naga inhabited the inland sea to the east of the theocracy. Their land-dwelling relatives uncommonly appeared along wilderness borders. None of them were good. Raids by Naga and their allies on fishing villages and attacks on border patrols happened often enough. Seeing a familiar and dangerous enemy, the paladins responded to its appearance by fortifying themselves against an impending magical assault. In addition to being physically powerful, Naga were commonly seen casting arcane magic of the third tier, sometimes the fourth. Having Fireball or Ice Storm cast multiple times into their side of the hall would be extremely problematic. Despite understanding the rough sequence of events, Marcus shifted to an anti-magic stance. His instincts screamed at him to dash forward and get the young woman away to safety. The Naga slowly made his way to take his place beside the woman, his pale scales gleaming in the light as he took several seconds to bring in the rest of his length and coil it below his torso. When he finally finished, the woman's head was barely above his elbow. Despite being mere centimeters from the hideous and deadly being, the woman's posture and gentle demeanor did not alter in the slightest. "Welcome to the city of Erantle," she said in dulcet tones. "My name is Florine, an administrative consultant for the Sorceress Kingdom." Florine placed her left hand lightly on the small of the Naga's back, gesturing to him with her right. "This is Eurarius Spinia Iandaran, who is in training to become an official for customs and immigration." Marcus' eyelid twitched. How could she stand to touch the disgusting creature? If Alessia were in this woman's place, there would probably be multiple stab wounds. "This, really? Eurarius," Florine smiled. "Yes," Lorenzo nodded thankfully. "That? You are training him? How did this come about?" "My duty here is in helping to establish the new orientation protocols for the city and the nation," Florine told him, "and ensuring that our staff receives proper training. I'm well versed in the laws and customs of the Sorceress Kingdom and its inhabitants, as well as those of the other nations in the region. Eurarius will be one of the officials who will assume this post once an acceptable standard is achieved." "Alone?" The captain frowned. "Is that safe?" "The sentry is just over at the entrance, so Eurarius will be able to call for assistance if ever he feels threatened." "That's, right. I see." Lorenzo glanced over at the other paladins and they sat back down. "As for how we met, Florian continued. It was while I was assisting with the organization of the territories to the north of the city. The local patrols informed me of his presence when he left the Great Forest of Tob. After a brief discussion, he told me that he was looking for work. I see, Lorenzo nodded to himself sagely, stroking his mustache. So this Naga just popped out of the forest and asked you for work. The captain made a noise as Marcus elbowed him under the table. He couldn't tell if Lorenzo was being sarcastic or not. Well, he didn't ask to work for me specifically, Florian said. I just happened to be someone in the area who could assist him. As for why, well, many residents of the Great Forest of Tob were His Majesty's subjects before the founding of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. You could say he's my senior of sorts. After some consideration, I suggested that he find gainful employment in the city and pointed out this posting. Eurarius is quite intelligent, so I don't doubt he'll be able to slip into his role faster than the other trainees. Marcus tried to imagine having a Naga as a neighbor in some city apartment. He felt a headache coming on. He lives in the city? A man's incredulous voice said it all. Well, he does work here, Florian replied. I'm not sure where else he would be expected to live. If you're wondering about his accommodations, the demi-human quarter in the city was expressly raised for people whose residential requirements are unfulfilled by human dwellings. The young woman paused for several moments. She continued when no one voiced any further questions on the matter. Now, Countess Corlin has informed me that most of your number will be attending to duties in her domain. As you'll sometimes be required to make trips to Erantal on various tasks, however, please ensure you commit the following points to memory. They're general guidelines for conduct in the city, as well as for lands primarily managed by humans. What about lands not managed by humans? A voice was raised from the opposite corner. They're still subject to the Crown laws, Florian replied, but local bylaws may also exist to facilitate the needs of different peoples. May I ask that you provide us with some examples? Of course, Florian said. Here, we've adopted the laws of Reistais as a foundational template for our nation, so you'll almost certainly see many similarities to what you may have experienced in the theocracy or other human lands abroad. All citizens are equal under the eyes of the law, and you should recognize many familiar ones extended to include all of His Majesty's subjects and territories. As nobles have administrative rights over their territories and decide how the land and its resources are utilized, non-human populations with territory granted to them are, too, entitled to govern their lands with their own methods of governance. Entering these territories to hunt game or forage without permission from the local government is considered poaching, just the same as it would be on human lands. Also, please understand that even if these local populations do not take advantage of various resources, proper channels must still be used to establish industries on their territory. Damage to land, even if it appears unoccupied, is considered damage to habitat and thus legally falls under property damage. Are there any cases where the land laws are drastically different? A paladin somewhere near the center asked. Within this duchy, no, Florian answered. A handful of people that work for the Sorcerer's Kingdom have been granted broad hunting rights in the wilderness of the Great Forest of Tob and the Azalizia Mountains. Be aware that the laws of the Sorcerer's Kingdom are only extended to visitors entering legally. Those found entering illegally or performing activities like smuggling are subject to local justice and do not enjoy the protection provided by the law. What does local justice entail? The question came from somewhere in the back. Well, if a smuggler was caught in human lands, they would be subject to the death penalty and hanged. In other territories, you will still be subject to the death penalty, but you might be eaten instead of hanged. Either way, the offender still faces capital punishment. Illegal immigrants are usually deported after an investigation. Any criminal acts accompanying their entry will, of course, result in the associated penalties. The remains of the dead are collected to be stored and utilized at a later date. The words rolled out so smoothly that one might have thought she was just describing laws in any other place. Florian paused once again, her gentle smile exuding its same sense of warmth and comfort. What if the judgment was made in error? A paladin on the other side of the room asked. Being eaten leaves little opportunity for appeal. One may, of course, formally submit an appeal. The local leadership will be obliged to wait for the verdict of the judiciary and an official will be dispatched. The hearing, however, will be conducted with domination magic. What? But anything can be forced on the subject with domination magic, false confessions, incriminating knowledge, artificial behaviors. Any evidence collected under such conditions would surely be dismissed as unacceptable in the courts of other nations. Marcus and the other paladins at his table nodded at the man's statement. The use of magical compulsion was generally treated as an act of barbarism in human nations for good reason. Florine did not falter, however, and delivered her explanation in the same gentle tones as before. The officials taking confessions through mind control have no reason to compel you to offer false testimony. In fact, doing so would be considered so abhorrent that they would submit themselves to be destroyed for failing in their duty to His Majesty. Is this some sort of cult? The paladin to his right frowned. Having fanatics as officials seems a bit. In this case, Florine replied, I'm referring to the undead servitors created by His Majesty. As paladins of the theocracy, you should be well versed in matters of magic. We are. His Majesty's servitors are powerful and intelligent, but they are still magical creations and prioritize their duties above all else. They will carry out His Majesty's will to the best of their ability, which brings me to my next point. Florine looked around the room. Her gaze stopped at their guide, who was standing by at the back of the hall. If I'm not mistaken, it shouldn't be your shift until later? Yes, my lady, he replied. Other guys still out of it from what happened the other day. That's understandable. A note of sympathy entered her voice. I hope he recovers soon. Anyway, on the subject of weapons in the city, you may carry weapons if you wish, but as with any other city, bringing polearms and other large weapons around with you in the streets is an impediment to others and potentially a hazard. Please store them somewhere safe. Sidearms are, of course, permitted. You may draw your weapons in self-defense or for other reasonable uses, such as releasing ropes with a blade or training between yourselves in private spaces. Drawing your weapon with the apparent intent to harm anyone under the protection of His Majesty's laws is a capital offense. The incident which resulted in the implementation of this orientation was witnessed by the man who is currently away, and he's been rather traumatized by it, as you can, or rather, can't see. You say apparent intent to harm, Marcus said, but how is this judged? What may look dangerous to a novice might be considered perfectly safe for an experienced combatant. The Death Knights around the city are quite adept at defending others. They can intercede against attacks even when most would think it impossible to do so. Rest assured, they will only act when they perceive an imminent threat. They will also respond to calls for assistance. Understanding how strong Death Knights were, Marcus had no reason to believe that they could not do what she had described. Now, on to the next point. Florine seemed to never lose her verbal measure. While it is common practice in other nations, the exchange of veils and douceur with those wielding the authority of the administration is prohibited. You're saying we can't tip, or offer gifts? Marcus frowned at the odd restriction. Only with whom I stated, yes. This includes all officials on duty, regardless of domain, militia, customs officials, office staff, postal workers and adventurers, to name a few. Adventurers? The voice of another paladin rose from behind him. Yes, the Adventurer Guild has been nationalized recently, as there is no need for them in their former capacity. I believe this happened in the theocracy quite some time ago? Yes, that's right, someone else said. Government workers are more than fairly compensated, so they do not depend on tips and the like. Veils and douceur to government officials will be construed as attempts at bribery, and fall under corruption laws. What about the aristocracy? Marcus asked. That depends. Florine turned her attention to him. If you're making an exchange as part of a house's private business or as a diplomatic custom, it's permitted. If they're being used in an attempt to influence policy or administrative processes, it obviously qualifies as bribery. Following identical lines, tipping members of a household retinue is also permitted. You'll only be warned once by the recipient if they decide you've stepped beyond the bounds of the law. Incarceration will follow if you persist. This seems a place where many lines may be blurred, Lorenzo said. How is the abuse of this allowance prevented? Nobles are responsible for their retainers, Florine told them. Nobles who run afoul of the crown laws do not remain nobles for long. Unlike other nations, the Sorceress Kingdom has both the will and the resources to ensure that rule of law is upheld. If you are uncertain how your actions may be interpreted, it would be best to err on the side of caution. Now, please allow Eurarius to provide you with a brief rundown of the remaining key points. The air went still at her sudden announcement, and everyone stared at the Naga. Eurarius sat frozen for a moment before looking down at Florian with an uncertain expression on his face. The young woman only looked back up at him with a wink and a bright smile, giving him a confident thumbs up. She was so endearing that Marcus wished that he was Ryu. No, wait. This one will continue now. The Naga frowned down at the desk before raising his gaze to address them. Many peoples live under His Majesty's dominion, and there are representatives of several who may be found living in the city. I have heard that our dear guests have come from a place in the south where those who are not human are received with hostility, so I will underline that you are expected to temper this conduct while in the Sorceress Kingdom. Performing hostile actions against our citizens and guests in accordance with the customs of your homeland will not serve as an excuse. But what if they do something to us? Alessia's voice came from a corner. This is, of course, illegal in the same way, Eurarius replied. Also, keep in mind that acts of provocation and various forms of indirect harassment are a simple matter to investigate with domination magic. Those who have lived under His Majesty's reign for some time have learned how to conduct themselves in a civil manner that is acceptable to the general population. It would do you well to emulate these forms where they can be applied. You expect us to act like dummy humans? Her voice rose in pitch. It is not reasonable to find common ground? Eurarius tilted his head. Humans comprise the majority of the citizenry, but more and more different peoples arrive in the city weekly. Surely you don't expect all races to adopt human customs? The question was met by silence, and Eurarius' eerie eyes blinked once lazily. Your animals, too, are your responsibility, he continued. As you have come through from the south, you will have seen a few of His Majesty's undead servitors on the bridge and in the harbour town. There are far more of them in the city. Your mounts may also show fearful or startled reactions at several of the predatory races here. This includes dragons. A low murmur rose over the paladins. Dragons were creatures that grew into vast strength over time, so they were best dispatched sooner rather than later. If they were counted among the Sorceress Kingdom's citizens, however, that meant that they were also protected by its laws. What happened if they flew to some distant place to pillage towns and caravans, using the Sorceress Kingdom as a shield against retribution? Are there many dragons? Alessia asked. There are, Eurarius looked down at Florian. There were 18 of them until recently, she answered. I believe a few more have joined us in the last month or so. They arrive and depart regularly, Eurarius said, so you will see them eventually if you stay here. Yes, if you wish to report what you believe to be criminal activity, you may do so with the undead officers at the militia posts all around the city. If you have any questions about the administration's services or are interested in leasing His Majesty's undead, the administrative office in the central district is open at all hours of the day, every day. There are few restricted areas. Only authorized persons may enter government offices and facilities, including the walls and sewers. On the conduct of temple staff, I believe your superior will address this. The Naga's dry voice seemed to slither from subject to subject, and Marcus had to concentrate on his words to separate everything. The chamber was silent for a while before he realized that Eurarius was finished. Alessia piped up again. Miss Florian said that you were a senior of sorts, she noted. What is the meaning of this? This one once reigned as a sovereign over a modest portion of the forest, Eurarius answered with a thin smile. This one was brought under His Majesty's dominion before the humans of these lands, so this should be her meaning. Their heads all turned to Florian, who shifted uncomfortably under their gazes. Who are you? Lorenzo asked after a brief silence. Florian Cadia Dale Gonye, she replied, Baroness of Gonye. A murmur filled the hall at her answer, and it was stopping himself from goggling at her was all Marcus could do. This was one of the nobles that their driver had mentioned. Considering how much praise had been heaped upon them, he had expected stern old matrons or bereaved wives unexpectedly inheriting titles and employing their decades of experience to achieve results similar to what had been seen in Corlin County. A beautiful young woman, no, she was far from being counted as an adult in the theocracy, was the furthest thought from his mind. Marcus then realized that everything about her spoke of the fact that she was a noble, from her appearance and elegant poise to her seamless grasp on administrative topics and overflowing charisma. Except demeanor, Marcus asked curiously, why did you introduce yourself in the previous manner? Because it shouldn't have mattered, Baroness Gonye replied, and I decided that introducing myself as a member of the nobility would change how you received the content of this orientation. My authority as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom, my titles, rights and privileges, my influence and wealth, only matter where they're supposed to matter. I've fashioned this orientation to impress upon you, good paladins, that rule of law reigns in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. However, I believe that I've done your perception a disservice by expressing it the way that I did earlier. For this, you have my apologies. Marcus frowned as she lowered her head apologetically. What did she mean by this? A subtle shift in her dulcet tones abruptly arrested his attention. Since I understand that you are to reside in our nation for an indeterminate period, her amber gaze swept over the assembly, allow me to be perfectly clear. While the laws practiced here may seem familiar to those of other nations, the Sorceress Kingdom is unlike any nation you have known. Like Marcus, the gazes of the paladins across the room were riveted to her as she spoke. A faint warning sounded in the corner of his mind, alerting him to the fact that he was being influenced by a skill or ability. That warning, however, went unheeded as Baroness Garnier continued to speak. First and foremost, our nation is a kingdom. Unlike the other nations in the region where various factions, government departments and powerful organizations vie for influence, ours is one where the will of our sovereign is absolute. His Majesty's will is conveyed through His Majesty's laws and policies. Authority flows down from His Majesty to all individuals invested with their specific duties and powers. When any government official, even a novice militia sentry standing watch over a village square, is occupying their post, they are ultimately acting to carry out His Majesty's will. Your Arius is an official of the Sorceress Kingdom, and while we do possess a degree of patience for those that require time to adjust to the realities of our nation, understand that your current attitude towards him hovers on the edge of being an insult to His Majesty's administration. Marcus remained silent in the wake of Baroness Garnier's words, their pressure lingering on the hearts and minds of the paladins in attendance. The Naga cleared his throat, and the young noblewoman released their attention. As you've received the content of our orientation, I will ask if you understand and accept the expectations for conduct within His Majesty's realm. The hall remained still, even following the Naga's query. Eurarius looked down at Baroness Garnier, who avoided his gaze. The hands crossed in front of her waist fidgeted nervously. Dear guests? The Naga spoke again. That is, yes, of course, Lorenzo finally replied. We have been charged with a sacred duty in the Sorceress Kingdom, so if this is what must be done, it will be done. Excellent, the Naga said. Then that will be all. Thank you for listening to this one. Your guide will lead you back outdoors, and you may enter the city proper at your leisure. He inclined his body ever so slightly, then looked at them expectantly. Lorenzo stood and turned around to face the contingent. With a nod and wave of his hand, he directed them to follow the militia officer back outside. Marcus stood and waited with Lorenzo, watching the paladins file out of the room in an orderly fashion. Behind them, Baroness Garnier could be barely heard, speaking in a low voice with Eurarius. See, that wasn't so bad, was it? She said, all of your hesitation over this must seem silly now. Half the room displayed their aggression when this one entered the hall. It was just a reaction, she replied, they reacted to me when I walked in, too. This one feels that your comparison is skewed. Oh hush, you. I'm just saying that people won't act on their impulses in such a straightforward manner as your former associate. If even paladins from the theocracy can curb their enthusiasm, then we should expect no less from anyone else. Your fears are entirely unfounded. Being turned into a purse, who comes up with such preposterous rumors? Their voices faded out of hearing as Marcus followed Lorenzo out of the door behind the others. They returned to their mounts and reformed the column. Marcus found himself beside Alessia again as they proceeded through the military district. He brooded as its ridiculous layout crossed his vision once again. Brother Marcus, Alessia faced forward as she spoke. This noble, she used a skill on us, yes? Marcus furrowed his brow at her assertion. Alessia glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. You men were all too busy making eyes at her that you did not even notice, she said. Perhaps the Grandmasters should have sent more women? That is not. It is. Her tone squashed his rebuttal flat. It is worse yet that you do not realize. How many of you were taking turns pulling her attention back and forth with your questions? The captain barely asked anything, and then I had to ask the scaly old man everything. He glowered at Alessia, but she only sniffed dismissively in response. Thinking back to the orientation, he tried to dissect the interactions between the Baroness and the Paladins. It was difficult to tell whether she had been actively using a skill throughout the session or it was just the result of her overflowing charisma, but the strong idea that she had imparted upon them near the end certainly could have been punctuated by the use of a skill. That she used some skill is possible, he admitted, but oratory skills are rarely wielded by nobles so directly. Seeing her in person, however, I have little doubt she is deserving of being so highly lauded by the people. It would not be surprising that such a talented individual has learned how. You are not worried she has done something to you? Done something? Marcus snorted. That is not how it works, yes? Vocations with oratory skills are not the same as magic casters. The priestess at the border did it too if you did not notice. Many different things must come together for them to manifest, but they are nearly always used to bolster or inspire others, or reinforce one's words. Bards, evangelists, leaders of large groups of people like nobles and commanders, they all have the potential to exhibit these skills, but it is not so easy that all can use them. Leader types of inhuman races often have these capabilities as well, which is why we prioritize their removal in combat. What's the worst she could have done against us, then? Nothing directly harmful, I think. The worst would be some sort of persuasion or intimidation, but she did no such thing. She just reinforced the importance of her words to us, purely for our benefit. Still, Alessia said, should there not be some law for that? How can there be a law for that? Marcus laughed. It would be like trying to stop merchants from haggling. We would have to arrest every bard for performing songs and poetry, every commander flogged for giving orders to their own soldiers. They passed into the second wall through the next gatehouse, entering the common area of Ranthal. It did not seem as bad as the military district, but it still bore an appearance that spoke clearly of its designers. The main thoroughfares were paved with cobblestones, while a web of unpaved streets and alleys branched out from them. Buildings along the major streets saw signs of recent refurbishment, but they were still often constructed and organized haphazardly. If one was to say something nice about it, they would probably comment on its cleanliness over anything else. There were apartments, shops, shophouses, warehouses, inventory lots and guild offices all jumbled together in no discernible order or regard for hazard. The confusing layout had him decide that it might be for defensive purposes, an attempt to disorient those who broke through the second wall just as much as he currently was. Though the city lacked a moat, the walls themselves were somewhat passable, but he did not see any way for defenders to manage breaches or defend against attackers enchanted with flight magic. There were no towers or anything similar placed in the wide open spaces between the walls to provide defense against aerial attackers. It was as if the builders constructed a city with larger walls, set aside a crude space for many soldiers and decided to call it a fortress city. Well, technically they had the right idea on a very basic level, but he didn't think Ranthal would have stood a chance against anything but weak ground assaults when they belonged to Riestais. A rather mundane fortress city built with mundane perceptions of warfare. Several large blazes set from above would have probably gutted the entire city within a night if what he saw so far was consistent with the rest of it. Taking the city intact would probably be the greatest challenge. Certainly, the Sorceress Kingdom could compensate for Ranthal's weaknesses with its overwhelming might, but the city was probably due for major changes when they were ready to do so. He was at a loss as to what could be done, however. Challenges to the amount of power displayed by the Sorceress Kingdom would just as simply obliterate the city, any city, really, in all the configurations he could think of. Anyone else would be simply scoured off of the field before they came within sight of the walls. Maybe they would just turn the fortress city into a regular city to optimize their capital's utilization of land. Marcus considered Corlin Harbor. Though it was much better constructed and organized, and not prone to rapidly spreading fires, it shared several of the same weaknesses as Ranthal. It relied on assaults being stopped by the castle, or forces on the field should they circumvent the castle. The defenses were sufficient for attacks by massive armies, while powerful individuals would be opposed by other powerful individuals. He thought of the woman that had come to dispose of the Death Knight in Katza Plains. She would be able to destroy any number of Death Knights and Soul Eaters, so the real question was what else the Sorceress Kingdom could field to challenge her. The outcome of that battle would tilt the balance of power irrevocably in favor of the victor, unless they had other powerful champions to field. A battle where none but the strongest mattered. Marcus shook his head. There was an order to strengthen warfare, but if so many beings like that existed, that order would be casually overturned. "Brother Marcus," Alessia said. "Why do you keep staring up blankly at nothing with your mouth half open? Oh. Is it a dragon?" Heads tilted upwards at her excited voice, looking to the unclouded cerulean skies. Alessia shaded her eyes with a hand and turned her head this way and that. "I was just comparing this territory to what it must have been before," he replied and looked back down to the street level. "Here, it is most apparent." "Oh," Alessia replied with audible disappointment. "Well, it could be seen on the way in through Corling County. The villages and hamlets beyond were not much changed, only the highway and the settlements upon it were new. The place between the first and second walls was quite irritating to behold, but the city around us is to be expected, no?" "I suppose," Marcus said in non-committal tones. "Of the city itself, I was not sure what to expect, especially of its people." Yes, I wonder how to tell the heretics apart? While the gods will know their own, it is not so easy to discern on this side. We are out of the south now, so most of these people should be so." The young paladin looked suspiciously at the pedestrians following the street. Anyone who met her gaze quickly averted their own and scurried off. "That is not what I meant. In the south, skeletons could be seen performing common labors, but here it is all sentries, patrols and some soul-eaters. The people here do not seem to openly use the undead in their daily lives." Alessia looked around as they traversed several city blocks. "This seems to be so," she said. "Perhaps there is no room? The city appears crowded enough as it is. Or they are followers of the Four and have difficulties embracing created undead as labor. Even one of our faithful might decline if all of their neighbors looked down upon them for doing so." "The children don't seem to care," Alessia noted a group play fighting along the street. "Ah, that boy just struck a death knight with a stick because his fellow ducked behind it." Marcus wondered what the limits behind such activity were in this chaotic city. Would the undead care that it was a child if they were damaged through some unlikely circumstance? He watched the children run along, screaming and shouting up a side street as they continued their imaginary battle and disappeared from view. The Death Knight only continued to monitor the surroundings from its corner. After traveling halfway into the common area, the busy streets opened up into an even busier plaza surrounded by an assortment of important-looking buildings. Hundreds of market stalls filled the space, selling all manner of wares. Ahead and to his left, Marcus saw the massive cathedral that he thought must be their destination, or was it a cathedral belonging to the others? Marcus hoped he wasn't one of the ones assigned to the city. It would be a constant headache trying to tell everything apart. Fortunately, a man was waiting in front of the entrance whose white vestments were lined with a hem of gold, the colors of an adherent of Ilah Alaf, marking him as one of the priesthood of the Six. They dismounted and Lorenzo made his greetings at the head of the column. After a brief discussion, the captain gestured for the rest of the column to follow him. Going around the perimeter, they found that the cathedral was much larger than it appeared. There was a long dormitory in the back, and they entered through a gate into a spacious cloister where many herbs and medicinal plants were being grown. There was a stable near the entryway that had fallen out of use for so long that it no longer smelled of horses. It was still in good condition, however, and the paladins found places for their mounts. Returning outside, they found the priest standing nearby, who led them into a side hall. Walking past several offices, they found themselves back at the front of the cathedral again. A small trickle of supplicants could be seen going in and out of the vestibule. Lion's heart. Several heads turned as Alessia cast the spell on herself. "What?" she said defensively. "I was so nervous that my heart was trying to come out of my breastplate." "It amazes me that you find His Excellency the Bishop more frightening than anything else we have come by here," Marcus said, and the men around them chuckled. After a minute of preparation, they entered the vestibule and turned into the cathedral. Within, they were greeted by an interior that might be seen in any cathedral within the theocracy. There were even old sacraments of the faith that he had never expected to see outside of their nation. Unlike the newly built temples in the settlements on their way, the cathedral had a sense of history. Signs of its use over generations were mended and polished with care. The light scent of incense and beeswax lingered in the air. As a whole, it gave the cathedral a sacred feeling, one that could be tangibly felt by those on its premises. The people praying and being ministered to in the aisles looked up at the armored column curiously. Ahead, a man who looked slightly older than Marcus awaited them, adorned in the vestments of a bishop. The paladins joined their captain in his crisp salute, then genuflected before the Bishop of Eranthal. "Your Excellency," Lorenzo said in a clear and solemn voice, "on behalf of my contingent and our brethren in the south, I greet you in the name of the Six. We have arrived in answer to your call, and to carry out the will of the gods. Blessings of the Six be upon you." The bishop's hands were held out in customary welcome. "Your arrival has been eagerly anticipated, a soothing hand for lands that yearn to feel the touch of the gods once more. I'm Bishop Austin, and I greet you on behalf of your brothers and sisters in the north. Please stand, good paladins, or have a seat, if you prefer." The latter was a strange thing to say, but Marcus fixed his expression as the paladins rose to stand once again before the bishop. Meetings like this were always strictly formal in the theocracy, so the bishop's suggestion that they might interact more casually made Marcus uneasy in turn. The rest of the column maintained their orderly rows. The bishop only smiled when he saw that no one would move. "Very well then," he said, "if this is what you prefer. In your time here, you'll come to understand that we practice many aspects of our shared faith a bit differently. You must also forgive me for not performing the usual rites. Though Eranthal is not a large city by the measures of our brethren from the south, there's still an ever-growing list of supplicants to tend to. Mana is quite scarce these days." "Of course, Your Excellency," Lorenzo replied. "Reportedly, your circumstances are great cause for us to rejoice, so an apology is unnecessary. We are proud to help shoulder your burdens, and our hearts are uplifted to see the return of our lost brethren." "I'll remind you of your words if ever you ask for a break," Bishop Austin said with a twinkle in his eye. "Let's review what's to be done, then. I trust that the city authorities have explained what is expected of both citizens and guests in Eranthal and its constituent territories." "We were invited to an orientation when we reached the city gate." "Yes," Lorenzo replied. "It may take some getting used to, but there should be no confusion over the points conveyed. I understand that the temples and their staff have authority of their own as well?" "That's correct," the bishop said. "Reisti's law is secular by definition, but the temples have the right to regulate the use of divine magic and see to the spiritual needs of the population. While this would be straightforward in a place like the theocracy, it becomes a great deal more complex in the sorcerer's kingdom. The faith of the Six is one of many present in this nation, the majority of the others being those of non-human peoples. In addition, there are quite a number of druids, shamans, spiritualists and other mystics here, also mostly non-human. The laws adopted by the sorcerer's kingdom regarding the temples have been expanded to include all of them." "I cannot imagine how this might work," Lorenzo frowned. "Where would our jurisdiction begin and theirs end? How do we even enforce that which is within our purview when the state has its separate laws to observe?" Marcus couldn't figure it out, either. Maintaining the order of each congregation still felt straightforward, but rates for spells were generally standardized and all temples kept to the same schedule. If there were many different religious organizations throughout the realm, did everyone just agree to the same thing? Or would the sick and injured simply seek the cheapest healers? Bishop Austin had a look on his face that suggested that he understood their confusion, being there once himself. "In Corlin County," he explained, "it's fairly straightforward as the living population is entirely human. The various peoples outside of the capital are, for the most part, segregated from one another, save for a few notable exceptions. Even being out in other rural territories does not present many issues. Each race tends to stay in the places that are best suited for them. In the future, however, population growth will eventually lead to some blending of lines. For the time being, the royal court has suggested that we put our heads together and figure it out before it becomes a problem. Legally, it isn't their place to dictate temple policy, so they've left the details to us to deal with." "So we are to collude with heretics and heathens? Demi-humans, heteromorphs and other inhuman monsters?" Lorenzo was aghast. It was a face-heel turn from the way that the temples handled things in the theocracy. There, the temple administration determined what was appropriate based on statistics collected from every part of the nation. It was not something that was negotiated. "It's about as difficult as your expression suggests," the bishop chuckled, "though probably not in the ways that you probably expect. The attitude of the temples existing prior to the Sorcerer King's reign, both those of the Six and of the Four, has not changed very much when it comes to interactions with foreign faiths from those times. The other faiths are insular by nature, being mostly rooted in tribal societies save for that of the Azalisia Mountain Dwarves. It's unheard of that anyone comes to blows over matters of religion here. Comparing all of the different rates for divine magic is what creates most of the headaches when attempting to establish standards. Comparing the rates? Yes, Bishop Hosteen smirked. The foremost issue is that most of them don't even use coinage for compensation, nor do they have any to begin with. Imagine me going to our first meeting and finding out that one group pays in roots, fish or berries, another in furs and trinkets, and yet another in menial labor or sexual favors. Never mind the latter, we had to call in the merchant guild to figure the rest out. Even they were driven to distraction since the material values between everyone didn't match from place to place. At least 3 races heal their people for no compensation, while one of the demi-human tribes in the Great Forest of Tob actually has the highest compensation. I can't help but ask, Lorenzo said, where do we sit on this scale? Near the bottom somewhere, the bishop replied with a helpless shrug. I suppose that it means our faithful enjoy the benefits of cheap divine magic? We were all left uncertain about what to do, while the merchants we called in were instead quite excited at their findings. In the end, we could only determine standard rates within the city. They are the same as our neighboring human nations. It will take time to figure out the rest. Will that mean that we should expect goblins and ogres to walk up and offer us payment for healing? Lorenzo frowned at his own words. No more than you would go to a goblin shaman for healing, I think. The bishop said. The various peoples tend to prefer the priesthoods they are familiar with, but there are ordinances that oblige us to aid in efforts to curb the outbreak of plagues or other emergencies that overwhelm what healers are normally available. These, too, are laws inherited from the old government. Before your faces turn any more sour, I will say that the government itself has access to several extremely powerful divine casters. They would be called upon first in such an emergency. Considering what I've seen and heard reported, a catastrophe on a national scale would have to occur to overburden them. Marcus straightened the frown that had unknowingly crept onto his face. Bishop Hosteen stepped away to retrieve a small binder from a pew in the front, flipping through its pages as he walked back. These powerful divine casters, Lorenzo asked, if they come from within the government? No, I will get to the heart of the matter. What we have seen of the temple staff on the way here, then the statues at the gate, Your Excellency, who is the Sorcerer King? Bishop Hosteen's hand stopped. He went and asked. The paladins looked up at the bishop expectantly. Surely he would have an answer to everything they had witnessed on their journey. Since you will be stationed in the city, Captain Lorenzo, the bishop said, you will see with your own eyes soon enough. What does that mean? The Sorcerer King regularly takes walks around Erantal, Bishop Hosteen replied. So by simply living in the city, he will eventually cross your path. That was not the sort of answer I was expecting, the captain said. The hint of an amused smile traced over Bishop Hosteen's lips over Lorenzo's dissatisfaction. His hand resumed flipping through the pages of the binder. Tell me, Captain, he asked. What do our scriptures say of the time when our gods lived amongst us? It was a blessed age when humanity was saved from the brink of extinction and sheltered by their unassailable might. The people of the time transcribed the tenets of our faith from their words. But what do our scriptures say of their daily lives? The bishop asked. How did the people conduct themselves around the gods when they walked amongst us? Did everyone fall to their faces in worship and adoration whenever they were graced by their presence? What rituals were performed in their name? What songs of praise did they sing? Captain Lorenzo's brows knit together as he frowned over the bishop's questions. Nothing of the sort is described, Your Excellency, he answered. Only that they lived amongst us and left descendants whose blood runs in our veins to this very day. Then knowing this, would it strike you as odd if His Majesty the Sorcerer King only wishes to see his people live in safety and happiness while also living amongst them? A long silence stretched on between them. Lorenzo's face went through a series of complicated expressions, reflecting Marcus' own thoughts. Something deep within him yearned for this, but something else cried out for more. Yet he could not expect any more than what was described. As was written in the scriptures of their faith, their gods simply lived amongst them, securing a place for humanity in a world without mercy for their kind. Marcus smiled ruefully to himself. What had he been expecting? A triumphal declaration of the gods' return? A grand crusade to lead humanity to its long-awaited glory? The scriptures never mentioned any of this, they were only wishes born of his ambition and pride. He looked to his left and right, to the supplicants in the pews arrayed to either side of him. As his eyes crossed over the old sacraments adorning the cathedral's interior, his rueful smile fell and sudden tears blurred his vision in a moment of crystalline clarity. On their journey, he had witnessed what he just suddenly realized in every laborer in every vineyard and orchard, in the villages, hamlets and the harbor. Yet, even as a paladin, he had been blind to its significance. The faithful of Rantel had been here for centuries. They were the legacy of those who had answered the call of the great seeding, the clerics, missionaries, evangelists and pilgrims, who left the safety of the theocracy to bring the light of the six to the world. They held fast through the great heresy of the North and, to this day, continued to endure. There was no great strength of arms here, no wealth, no advantage. No sprawling institutions or political systems spearheaded the mandate of the gods. It was a place hostile to the faith of the six, and against the spiritual and cultural adversity of centuries, faith stood alone. In every man, woman and child, the pure flame of that faith continued to burn, their spirits refined and tempered to a degree unseen even in the seat of the theocracy's power. Even with the advent of a god, they carried on unperturbed, assured and content. They were as the humans of 6 centuries ago, with whom the gods had chosen to dwell. If he is truly descended upon this place, this must be the reason why. The seat of the faith was in the slain theocracy, but its soul resided within the sorceress kingdom. Marcus scrubbed his cheeks as he purged his pride and presumption. Rather than he and his fellow paladins being here to help guide the people, it felt like they had come only to be shown the way. "No, Your Excellency," the captain's voice wavered with barely suppressed emotion, "all is as it should be. Thank you for opening our hearts to the truth." Bishop Austin did not reply, nor did he make any readable gestures. Instead, he finished flipping through his binder, drawing out a small stack of papers. "I'm glad to hear it," he handed the documents to the captain. "As things are as they should be, your duties await. Here are your assignments. Of your number, only 7 will be staying here in Rantel. The rest will be serving in various parts of Corlin County. Your work is not dissimilar to that of temple guards in the theocracy, save for the fact that the majority of your time will be skewed towards aspects of civilian ministry. There are more than a few of us going to territories with the Katza Plains nearby," Lorenzo noted as he sifted through the assignments. "Will we be called upon to remove undead, should they appear?" "No, and yes," the bishop replied carefully. "National security is primarily dealt with by the administration, including patrols that keep the undead from Katza Plains out of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The administration has not precluded the idea that hostile beings, including undead, may still appear inside the borders, so you are authorized to deal with these threats should you be on hand. More often than not, however, the locals will report them to the local security forces rather than the local temple or shrine. The undead forces of the Sorcerer's Kingdom can discern between their own and any hostile undead, so they have an easier time with it than we do. Accidental attacks against undead servitors have happened in the past, and the fines are quite substantial." "I suppose we have guessed correctly, then," Lorenzo said. "We will be working with the congregations for the most part, and any sort of militant action will be limited." "That's correct," Bishop Austin nodded, "though we're so endlessly busy here that you'll probably start thinking that fighting the undead every day is easier. If you've any questions about your assignments, I'll be more than happy to answer. The midday service is starting in about an hour, however, so we'll be getting busy here in a bit." The captain turned around to face the contingent, calling out a name before handing out each assignment. Marcus retrieved his own, looking down at the neat, angular handwriting detailing his assignment. He would be heading back to Corlin County to serve in the harbor town. There were no expenses, most were handled by the local temple, just as in the theocracy. A modest allowance was provided, of an amount expected for a temple guard. His eyebrows rose when he saw that he was granted a home in the town by House Corlin. Around him, Marcus noted many others reacting similarly as they read through their own assignments. So much for wondering if he could buy a new house with the mithril plaque, he had just been given one instead. Fishing the favor from his belt pouch, Marcus walked up to the front of the group. "Captain, he said as he held up the shining green slip of metal between two fingers. "We are to return these, yes?" "Ah, right." Lorenzo looked up from reading the documents before him. "Your Excellency, how are these to be handled?" There should be a case for those," the bishop said. "Once you've retrieved them all, I'll have someone from the Merchant Guild come and pick them up." Another paladin came to address the bishop and he turned to speak to him. Marcus walked up to Lorenzo. "So, where did the good captain end up?" Marcus asked, holding out the mithril plaque for collection. "The good captain ended up in the city," Lorenzo replied. "Though this should have been obvious." "You have all the comforts of the city," Marcus said. "And all the rest that comes with the city," Lorenzo rolled his eyes. "From that smug look on your face, I take it that you believe you have landed some choice assignment?" "I have no such look, do I?" "Oh, you do." Marcus cleared his expression, though he did not quite believe what Lorenzo said. "Well, I have been assigned to Corlin Harbor," Marcus said, "managing the others in the county." "Who is the captain now?" Lorenzo grunted, "Though as my second, this also should have been obvious." "Well, I still report to you. We will be seeing each other often enough, I think." "Oh wonderful," Lorenzo snorted. "You get to watch my hair slowly fall out in this crazy place. What of your old squire?" "I have not asked her yet." "Speaking of which, did the matter we spoke of come to pass?" "Yes. Once we are settled, I am to start formalizing things. We are all to take as many new squires as we can handle, save for our young sister Alessia. She will have ordeals of her own." "Ordeals?" "I will let her tell you, if she means to." "Yes, what is it?" Lorenzo addressed a paladin that appeared at Marcus' side, and Marcus left him to deal with the other members of the contingent. He found Alessia sitting on a pew halfway down the aisle, staring down at her assignment. "So, the great mystery is finally unveiled," Marcus grinned down at her. "What adventures lie in store for our future hero?" Alessia started at the sound of his voice. She scowled up at him. "That is not funny, brother Marcus." His grin faded. "What is the matter? His Excellency the Bishop does not appear to be a mean-spirited man. For what reason did he request your presence?" I am to serve as adjutant to Vicar Aspasia," she said. "A cleric of Sursana." "A vicar? What sort of vicar?" "The young sort." "There," Marcus' grin returned. "Is it not as I said before we came? That seems perfectly fine too." Alessia's assignment appeared in front of his face. He stopped to read over it. His light expression melted away by the time he was 2/3 of the way through. "What is the meaning of this?" He couldn't keep the shock out of his voice. "You are to..." Marcus stumbled backwards as the head of a warhammer whipped out from behind the sheet of paper and nearly grazed his nose. "HSST." Alessia stood and waggled the weapon in his direction. "Say nothing. If the others hear, I will die of shame." "Why this? Why me?" "Why, indeed?" Marcus thought to himself. He was right about the first half, but the remainder just seemed so terribly wrong. "Will he?" raised his hands as Alessia threatened him with her warhammer again. "Will you speak to His Excellency about this?" "There is nothing to speak about," she replied. "This is what I will be doing. For this, I was expressly summoned." It could not be that bad, could it? Marcus wasn't sure how to console her. Alessia lowered the paper and the warhammer. She looked up at him with a blank expression, and her lip twitched. "Ha!" She turned to sit back down and stare at her assignment again. Marcus meant to share the details of his own assignment with her, but Alessia would probably go berserk upon seeing it. He took one last look at his former squire before turning around to find many members of the contingent awaiting him. "That's right, I have to lead them back south now. Go ahead and get some lunch," he told them. "Many of you will be out in the villages, so you will not be seeing much of the city for a while. Try and pick up everything you will need from here." The group dispersed, and Marcus went to address the few that were still around the chamber. When he finally finished and followed after his men, Alessia was still sitting where he had left her, frowning down at her new duties.